One, two, three. And good afternoon to the members of the viewing public, Tobagonians, members of the media, and the diaspora. I am here with you this afternoon to discuss two matters with respect to the governance of Tobago at this time. I therefore want to get straight into the first issue, which is a response to the Chief Secretary's press conference this morning. And I paid particular attention to what the Chief Secretary had to say with respect to the assignment of two secretaries in the Division of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities, and Transportation. And you see, while the Chief Secretary fumbled, mumbled, and jumbled his way, trying to justify this very confusing action, what the Chief Secretary failed to recognize is that the focus of the discussion and the confusion is not so much with respect to the legality and to his authority, but one that really treats with the disrespect and disregard for us as Tobagonians, with respect to us being informed, with respect to his administration being transparent and accountable to the people of Tobago. Because you would see under Section 34(1) of the THA Act, the Chief Secretary is correct that he alone holds the authority to assign responsibilities to secretaries. But with that authority comes full accountability. And therefore, the Chief Secretary is solely responsible for the chaos and the confusion now engulfing the public space with respect to the assignment of the two secretaries in the Division of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities, and Transport. Because what we have witnessed over the past 2 weeks, especially the last week, on the return of the Secretary of Tourism, Ms. Tasha Boris, has been an open dog fight, perhaps cat fight, or even fowl fight among two of his favored secretaries, directly caused by this Chief Secretary's weak and confusing leadership. And I specifically use the term weak and confusing, and I would demonstrate why the term weak and confusing is used to describe the Chief Secretary's leadership by playing to you some clips of what would have transpired over the last week. And therefore, I ask the producer to play a series of clips that would demonstrate to you, fellow Tobagonians, that our Chief Secretary has caused chaos and confusion in the Tobago space, unnecessarily so, by his failure to take decisive actions. Yeah. Straight to you, fellow Tobagonians, that our Chief Secretary has caused chaos and confusion.
As we were coming out of the week, and I'm getting the weekly report from Secretary Hackett, and seeing the work that was done, and the work that is required, and what she was able to do and not do, and then having had a conversation with the stakeholders for the Tobago October Carnival, this Chief Secretary decided that he will reassign some of the duties from Secretary Hackett to, from Secretary Boris to Secretary Hackett. So I reassigned in writing, not word of mouth, the duties for antiquities and culture to Secretary Hackett, and Secretary Boris remains with the duties for tourism and transportation. Guess what? I am legally authorized so to do. I can give duties to anybody temporarily for any length of time, any amount of duties. I am so authorized to do in law. There is nothing illegal about that. There is nothing illegal about that. I am authorized, if I so choose, to split the duties of a division and to remove some from under one secretary and assign those duties with the full powers of Section 37(1) to another secretary. And so what I have done is that I have assigned the duties for antiquities and culture to Secretary Hackett, and I have indicated to both Secretary Hackett and Secretary Boris that I'm doing this temporarily, and that at a time of my choosing, I will revoke those duties from being under the purview of Secretary Hackett. I am so legally authorized.
And saying quite plainly that he not only verbally informed both Secretary Boris and Secretary Hackett of the reassignment arrangement. And thereafter, I'd want to play to you the clip with respect to what transpired in the House on Thursday when it was asked plainly to Secretary Boris whether she was in fact still the Secretary of the Division of Tourism, Antiquities, Culture and Transportation, where she responded in the affirmative, confirming that as of Thursday, as far as she was aware, unless otherwise told, she remained the Secretary of the entire division. So I would play that clip for you as to demonstrate again the chaos, the confusion, and the conflicting stories coming out of this situation. One where you have the chief secretaries on record now as saying that he verbally and by writing informed both secretaries of the reassignment, and you have a secretary even after the asserted verbal and written
Councillor Boris.
I am not sure what I should be answering to Madam Presiding Officer, because no member of the public is sitting around this horseshoe. So until I am informed and this House is informed that I'm no longer a councillor and welcome around this horseshoe with the appointment as Secretary in charge of the Division of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities and Transportation, I am still the Secretary.
In the last 2 weeks, as a part of my temporary responsibility over culture and antiquities specifically, I have dedicated time to meet extensively with Administrator of the Division of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities and Transportation, my colleague, Assemblyman George, Assistant Secretary in DOTCAT, and of course, Technical Advisor Dr. Charleston Thomas, as well as CEO Mr. But I must say, and I mean, we're really all here hoping and praying that, it gets the attention it deserves. But what I can let you know is I've had conversations on the Chief Secretary's beckoning with Minister with responsibility for civil aviation and transport, Minister Eli Zakur, as well as Minister with direct responsibility over Caribbean Airlines, that is the Minister of Finance, Mr. Tanku. Also had conversations with the leader of government business, Minister Padarat, and we have all assurances that we're going to get some relief as it relates to Caribbean Airlines.
Even for the administrator, you could imagine the public servant being in the middle of this madness And therefore, I'll play the final clip of the secretary who has temporary assignment and responsibilities for antiquities, confirming that she has had that position for the last 2 weeks.
What I must say, and I mean, we're really all here hoping and praying that, it gets the attention it deserves. But what I can let you know is I've had conversations on the Chief Secretary's beckoning with Minister with responsibility for civil aviation and transport, Minister Eli Zakur, as well as Minister with direct responsibility over Caribbean Airlines, that is the Minister of Finance, Mr. Tanku. Also had conversations with the leader of government business, Minister Padarat, and we have all assurances that we're going to get some relief as it relates to Caribbean Airlines. In the last 2 weeks, as a part of my temporary responsibility over culture and antiquities specifically, I have dedicated time to meet extensively with Administrator of the Division of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities and Transportation, my colleague, Assemblyman George, Assistant Secretary in DOTCAT, and of course, Technical Advisor Dr. Charleston Thomas, as well as CEO Mr. Kern Cowan. What I must say, and I mean, we're really all here hoping and praying that, it gets the attention it deserves. But what I can let you know is I've had conversations on the Chief Secretary's beckoning with Minister with responsibility for civil aviation and transport, Minister Eli Zakur.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, for an abundance of clarity, what we have just witnessed is conflicting accounts between both the Chief Secretary and the two secretaries. And this matter is no light matter. This matter is no joking matter. And I'll tell you why this matter is a serious matter. Because we have the Chief Secretary claiming he verbally and formally notified both secretaries of the split in the Division of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities and Transport, with one secretary holding the position of tourism and transport responsibilities, and the other secretary temporarily being assigned the responsibilities for culture and antiquities. But at the same time, you have yet last Thursday, when that question was asked in the Assembly Legislature, Secretary Boris declared that she was still the Secretary of the Division of Tourism, Culture, Transportation and Antiquities until she was told otherwise. And that part is important, because if the Chief Secretary saying that I told both secretaries by writing of the split, and on Thursday the Secretary of Tourism is saying I received no such information, and therefore I have been operating for the last couple days since I've returned as the secretary for the entire division, it means either the Chief Secretary lied or the Secretary of Tourism is lying. And if I was a betting man, based on former and personal interactions, I would put my money on the Secretary of Tourism in this one, because we know the Chief Secretary has a very successful history with misrepresenting situations. And therefore, in this situation where you have the Chief Secretary giving one account and the Secretary of Tourism giving another, one has to ask the question, who is lying? And if the Secretary of Tourism is lying, it therefore means that the Secretary of Tourism is not just lying to the people of Tobago, but she would have misled the House in the Tobago House of Assembly by knowingly reporting something to be true, which is not. And that is a matter for the Privileges Committee, because the Secretary of Tourism was clear on that day that she remains the Secretary of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities, and Transportation until otherwise told so. And the chief secretary is on record as saying, for quite some time, I have told both secretaries by writing that the positions and the portfolio has been split between the two secretaries. So this statement directly contradicts the chief secretary's account and timeline, especially since Secretary Hackett herself confirmed she has been acting with responsibility for both antiquities and culture for the last 2 weeks. The people of Tobago, as I said, must now ask, was Ms. Boris, Secretary Boris, misleading the House and the public? Or is the Chief Secretary himself misleading Tobago about how the changes were communicated? And finally, we all must accept and admit that the whole arrangement and the way how this has been handled has been poorly handled by the Chief Secretary from the jump. Because you would recall what we received as Tobagonians was simply a press release indicating that Ms. Zorisha Hackett has been temporarily assigned the portfolio of Secretary of the entire Division of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities and Transportation with no definitive timeline. And we all started to ask, what is wrong with the Secretary of Tourism to cause this temporary arrangement? We all started to wonder, when will the Secretary of Tourism return, because there was no timeline with respect to her return. And of course, it was only last Thursday we saw the Secretary of Tourism showed up in the House, and Mr. Duke, within his right as a member, had to ask through the PO whether the Secretary of Tourism was in fact back on the job as the Secretary of Tourism. And it was only then we as the people of Tobago were so informed that the Secretary has resumed the duties and has assumed duties for the entire division, only to be told a day after, when a press conference was being had by the Tobago Festival Commission, that Ms. Zorisha Hackett has been temporarily assigned the temporary portfolio and responsibilities of culture and antiquities. And to date, up to that time, we received no communication from the Chief Secretary, no press release informing us of that change, and therefore it is highly disrespectful and highly disappointing and highly out of place for the Chief Secretary to treat Tobagonians as if we don't deserve to know. And it is only because we started to raise concerns as to how would this arrangement work. The Chief Secretary then comes out with a press conference this morning, and rather than accept responsibility for the mess that he created, he started to chastise those who were asking legitimate questions as to, one, the legality, as to two, the confusion, and as to three, whether this information has been properly documented and reported and organized amongst the various players. Because in this situation, it is not just the politicians and the members of the Executive Council alone who is facing this confusion, but you also have the administrative arm, the chief administrator. Has she had any official documentation of who is responsible for what? And what about the administrator in the Division of Tourism and Culture and Antiquities and Transportation? How then do they manage the instructions coming to them? Because even now you have the secretary, the temporary secretary who is assigned with responsibility for culture and antiquities, talking about issues that are directly under the remit of transportation. For example, you heard her in the press conference stating that she started to have conversations with the Minister of Transport on transport arrangements with CAL. And you would think whether you would think that transportation, which the Chief Secretary says is still the remit of the Secretary of Tourism and Transport, will be something that will be dealt with by that Secretary. And so already you are seeing the confusion emanating and the blurred lines starting to come to fore. And you can imagine the confusion for the administrator, who now has to take instructions from two different secretaries, two secretaries of which seems to be clearly at odds with one another, because when the temporary secretary spoke, she said she spoke to the assistant secretary, she spoke to all the chairpersons of boards, and she spoke to several others. But at no point in time did she mention that she spoke to her co-secretary, because both of them now hold joint positions in the Division of Tourism. At no point did she mention speaking to that secretary as to make sure they have a smooth transition with respect to their responsibilities. So, ladies and gentlemen, by the Chief Secretary appointing this temporary secretary, what is clear is that the Chief Secretary is clearly saying to all of us that he has lost confidence in the Secretary of Tourism. And also he has lost confidence in his Assistant Secretary of Tourism. Because if you now require a secretary who already has very demanding portfolio to come to assist your Secretary of Tourism to plan a carnival, and also assist the Assistant Secretary of Tourism to plan a carnival, it means therefore this Chief Secretary has lost confidence in his Secretary of Tourism, and what he has in essence did, he has cowardly fired the Secretary without firing the Secretary. That is the reality of the situation, and the Chief Secretary has therefore demonstrated himself to be a weak and a coward, because he's afraid of making and taking tough decisions. And perhaps we have to ask the question whether the Chief Secretary is so compromised, why he can't make such decisions. Because the evidence is clear. The evidence is clear that the Chief Secretary has agreed with the rest of Tobago in recognizing and admitting that the Secretary of Tourism is but the worst Secretary of Tourism to ever walk the face of Tobago. And he has now come to that realization, but he's unafraid to make the tough decision and has brought the Division of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities, and Transportation into odium and disrepute. Because now you have a chaotic situation where a secretary appears to have held on to a position as the secretary, while you have the Chief Secretary making this appointment of a temporary secretary in cohabitation with the secretary. So here you have in one division two secretaries with distinct responsibilities, but at the same time one secretary is saying to us that I remains the secretary, and the Chief Secretary must now clear up whether he in fact, one, did in fact write to that secretary about the reassignment of functions within that division, whether the secretary is so informed that he has quietly taken away some of our responsibilities, and where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? So, brothers and sisters, this again is symptomatic of the type of governance that has presided over Tobago for the last 4 years. It has been chaos, it has been confusion, it has been mismanagement, it has been incompetence, and it has all come to a head in this latest development where you have the Chief Secretary not properly, one, communicating to us, perhaps not properly communicating to his own secretaries, to the point that in one division you have a temporary assignment operating for the last 2 weeks, and you have the other secretary still functioning, as she told us last Thursday, as the secretary for the entire division. So you can only imagine the chaos and the confusion. And therefore, we all have to ask ourselves whether the secretary continues to function as just the secretary with responsibility for tourism and transport, or whether, as she told us last Thursday, she is the secretary for the entire division. Ladies and gentlemen, the second matter I want to treat with quite quickly is the matter of water. And you would have heard from many Tobagonians across the length and breadth of Tobago, whether you live in Charlottesville, whether you live Crown Point, Moriah, Lakoto, Darrell Spring, Wim, Union, wherever you are, Sanctus Hill, the cry over the past few weeks have been the unavailable and inconsistent supply of water throughout Tobago. As a matter of fact, I had the unfortunate situation of listening to a tourist while purchasing some food in the West. And that tourist reported to me that he was staying at one of our more recognized hotels in Tobago. And at that hotel, he was unable to get a shower because the hotel had no water. And I'm saying to myself, right now things are quite slow, but we are about to approach a very busy period where the bread and breakfast people are reporting already that occupancy is about 90% in terms of bookings. You're seeing the Hotel and Tourism Association people saying they too are seeing strong bookings. And therefore we expect an influx of people into the island come October month end for the carnival. And I will hate to believe that during that period we continue to experience the kind of inconsistent and unstable supply of water that currently befaces us. And therefore I'm calling on the Minister of Public Utilities. You had a lot to say about water and pipes. As an opposition member and the shadow minister for public utilities, you are now responsible for water and pipes. Please ensure that Tobago's pipelines have water to supply our various communities. The board was over here recently doing photo ops, and it is quite ironic that as soon as they left, you would think that they would have ensured that certain things would have been prioritized as to ensure that we can have a functioning supply of water in Tobago. But that situation remains extremely, extremely concerning. And I'm calling on the minister to prioritize the supply of water in Tobago. I am calling on the chairman of WASA to prioritize the supply of water, and I'm calling on the chief secretary. It appears, and I hope you Tobagonians are taking notice, that this chief secretary now have a Momo chief secretary when it comes to the issues of Tobago treating with the central government of Trinidad and Tobago. That very same chief secretary who had a lot to say on every matter and always was blaming and putting blame on the central government, even perhaps when it was not so due. He has now gone silent, he has now gone soft, and he has now gone missing when it comes to the matters that are important to us here in Tobago. Where is the Chief Secretary's voice on this? 3 weeks to a month now, many places are telling you they are getting water, if so long, once a week. Some not getting at all. And not a word from the Chief Secretary, not a word from the Secretary of Public Utilities on this matter. So I, as minority leader, am calling on the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the Minister of Public Utilities. This is an urgent crisis developing in Tobago, and I'm calling on you to act decisively. And finally, brothers and sisters, here's a matter I will ask the minority councillor to treat with respect to gratuity as I close off this press briefing. Minority councillor.
Good afternoon to members of the media, members of the public. Thanks again for joining us. As the minority leader indicated, our final discussion for this afternoon's press briefing is in relation to gratuity payments to contract workers. So over the past months, the Office of the Minority Leader has been inundated with calls from concerned contract workers across Tobago in relation to non-payment of gratuity. And up to this morning, yet again, we have received another report of such non-payment of gratuity upon the successful completion of contracts. This issue is not new, and this administration would have come into office indicating that they will fix it. And fixing it was one of the issues in relation to gratuity. Under the PNM administration, the past PNM administration, we would have attempted, but we would have standardized contracts for 3 years. This would have allowed for predictability in terms of persons employed, as well as would have built some level of trust among financial institutions. Today, we are seeing where, yet again, contract workers have been complaining that they have successfully completed their contracts, and several months after the completion of the contracts, gratuity payments remain unpaid. And as a result, today, we are calling on this administration, we are calling on the Chief Secretary, we are calling on the respective divisions to prioritize payments. On previous occasions where we came to you, we would have spoken about the yes interns not being paid. We would have spoken about suppliers being unpaid. We would have spoken about the issue of lack of supplies at offices and departments, divisions within the Tobago House of Assembly. Yet again, we are today bearing and bringing to the fore the cry of contract workers who, upon successful completions of their contract, have not been paid their gratuity. We are calling on the Chief Secretary again and this administration to prioritize payment of gratuity to contract workers, and please do that with a level of alacrity. So again, I want to thank the members of the media for joining us this afternoon for this very important press briefing. We do hope that the information that we would have brought to light would inform you and help you to make informed decisions in the coming weeks and months. And at this time, I want to hand over to the minority leader to conclude this press briefing.
Thank you so much, Councillor Benoit, for raising this very important matter. And I just want to contextualize this issue of contract gratuity, because last Thursday we were called as the legislators in the Assembly to deal with a motion that was brought by this current administration, where they attempted to pretend to be looking after the welfare of former assembly members. Lo and behold, only in the wind-up by the mover of the motion, the leader of assembly business, Ms. Zorisha Hackett, the truth came out where she admitted that in looking at that motion, they then broadened the scope of the motion to include attempting a situation where they are galvanizing arrangements so they can secure their pensions after 4 years. So I want you to put that into context, Tobago. This current administration, on the heels of their term expiring, is attempting to create a situation where they are going to be pensionable after serving only 1 term. And these are the same jokers who had the world to say about the SRC report and how unjust it was with respect to not treating with workers first. And here we have a situation where we have contract workers who would have honestly and diligently completed their contracts. And after they have completed their contracts, the only kind of payment that they're entitled to post that contract is their gratuity. And they have to suffer through years, months of waiting for that payment. Yet you had the secretary, the leader of assembly business, Ms. Hackett, crying crocodile tears about trying to get pension for herself, recognizing they have failed and Tobagonians are ready to fire them and they are trying to secure their pension. But you Tobagonians, you contract workers who have worked honestly, diligently, and professionally, ensuring that the assembly continues to function, you have to beg, you have to plead, and you have to hope that your gratuity, which is part of your contract entitlements, that you would get it in a timely manner. This administration continues to put Tobagonians last while they put their Trinidad financiers first. And again, in this issue of contract gratuity, we are calling on them to prioritize and pay the outstanding gratuity to contract workers now. And that is our call today. So as we wrap up, I just want to reiterate the 4 issues we would have treated with today, responding to the contradictions of the Chief Secretary's press conference, where in one breath he said he wrote informing the 2 secretaries of the split, while up to last Thursday, one secretary continues to claim that she is in fact the secretary of the entire division. So which is it? Who is lying? Who is telling the truth? And how are we going to move forward as an assembly, especially the administrators and the public servants who now have to deal with this chaos and this confusion caused by a weak and cowardly chief secretary? I also raised the issue of WASA and water and the unstable supply of water across the length and breadth of Tobago, which is becoming a real issue. And I'm asking WASA, is it that what is the problem why all of a sudden in Tobago, all across the length and breadth of our communities, water supply seems to be at an alarmingly low level, where persons are getting once a week, sometimes none at all. We also, through Councillor Benoit, raised the issue of the non-payment of contract gratuities, where some people are depending on that gratuity to pay various bills, etc., and just aren't being paid. We are asking you to prioritize those payments. So members of the media, fellow Tobagonians, I want to thank you for your time and for taking, interest in the governance of Tobago as we, the minority, bring to you those issues that are very important to the governance of this island. I thank you.